Hey, it's Rachel at Journey Back Quilts. In this brand new series, we're going to be exploring traditional quilt blocks. In this lesson, we're going to be making the Churn Dash block, also known as hole in the barn or monkey wrench. Let's get started. All right, to make this Churn Dash block, we're going to need a couple pieces of fabric. Now, you're only going to need really two different fabrics. One for a background. I'm using Confetti Cotton's Cloud, and one print or a color or something that's going to be contrasting to your background. I have one of Lori Holt's prints here and from my stash, so I can't remember which line it's from, but what we're going to do first is make half square triangles. So if you remember in lesson 3 of my basics lessons, we made half square triangles 4 at a time. So we're going to do that again. So you're going to need 2 squares that are 7 inches. And then you're going to need 4 squares of your background that are measuring 2.5 by 4.5. And same with your patterned. And then you'll also need a background that's 4.5 inches square. Okay, so let's take these 2 blocks to the sewing machine first and make our half square triangles. So you're going to put them right sides together and let's go sew them down. This is the easiest way to make half square triangles, and we are going to be making them 4 at a time. So all you want to do is match up your raw edges, make sure it's right sides together, and then we're just going to sew all the way around this block at a 1/4 inch seam. So I use a 1/4 inch seam foot with this guide on it, which is really handy because then the fabric can butt right against that blade here, and it will just run right next to it so that I know I have a 1/4 inch seam. If your machine doesn't have one of these feet or an attachment for it, then you can get tools like this diagonal seam tape. And it has a 1/4 inch guideline on it. So you're just going to line up this red line with the center of your needle where your needle's coming down, and then you can line your fabric up with the 1/4 inch guide on this side. So let's go ahead and sew this down. We're just going to sew around the entire thing, around the entire box. And here's another tip. When you get to the end, we're going to leave our needle down, but to get exactly at the right distance to be a 1/4 inch, this line right here on the edge of your foot is the 1/4 inch line. So if you just sew right up to the edge of your fabric to that line, you'll be at a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to leave my needle down, lift my foot, rotate the block, and there we go. Now before I trim this, I like to set my seam, which just means I'm going to take my iron and just lay it on those seams and iron it all flat. That just helps so any of the fabric that might have gotten a little bunchy from our stitches will help lay flat again. So when we trim it, everything's going to line up really nicely and not be wonky. I like to work with really flat, straight fabric as often as I can. It just makes things easier to line up and get correct. Okay, here comes the fun part. Now we're going to cut this into quarters going diagonally. So I'm just going to line up my ruler diagonally and cut it both directions. And now we need to iron them again. There's 2 ways you can iron these. You could either open it all the way and open your seam. But what I like to do when I can is just iron towards the darker side. So I'm going to put the light side on my ironing board and let the iron do the work for me. If you've watched some of my tutorials before, the iron is going to sit on this block and just hit that seam, pushing it all the way over towards the darker fabric. And I like to use my clapper just because it helps take the heat away and lay my fabric really flat. Like I said, I really like my fabric to be as flat and straight as possible. You don't want to use steam in your iron or starch at this point because it will shrink your blocks. Next, we need to trim all of these down to 4.5 inches. So to do that, I'm going to put the diagonal of my ruler on the diagonal of my block and scooch it up to 4.5, so that 4.5 is at least lined up. These are coming out exactly 4.5 inches, but we have just a hair that we can skim off there. So go ahead and do that to all 4 of these, and then I'll see you back here in just a second. Okay, now that we have all of those trimmed, we need to go put these 2.5 by 4.5 inch strips together. Let's go to the machine. So we're just going to take one background and one pattern, and we're going to put those right sides together. And then we're going to sew them down on the long side of the block. And we can just chain piece all of these. So I'm just going to sew right off of this first block, leave my needle down, get the next one ready, lift the foot, put it right there, and just keep sewing. Chain piecing is a way to save time and money because you won't be wasting a ton of thread every time you have to break your thread and take the block out and you have this giant tail. This way you just have this little tiny bit of thread in between each of these blocks, which will clip apart as soon as we're done. It's also a good way to keep track of all of your blocks so that they're not floating around, flying away from you. They're all connected. So I'm just going to use the little slicer on the edge of my machine, or we do have blade saver thread cutters in our shop if you're interested in one of those. So let's go take these to the ironing board. And like our half square triangles, I'm just going to iron these towards the darker fabric. So again, the light fabric is on the ironing board so that our seam is resting here. And then when we use the iron, we're going to set it here and just push it over, sliding that seam over to the darker fabric. I like doing this better than just setting the iron right down on top of it, because you may accidentally fold the fabric over just a tiny bit, and then you'll have this little tiny bit of fabric of a flap right here, which will mess up your dimensions. So we want to make sure that that iron's all the way open. Same thing is if you're going to iron it from the back and you just slide it over, you may accidentally just iron it over with this tiny little bit of flap over here. So this is the best way I found to iron, is just setting the iron on the light piece and push that seam over. All right, these should be measuring 4.5 inches. Just going to double check that. They are. So that center line should be at 2.25. Everything's perfect at 4.5. Great. Now we can lay out this block. So I'm going to take my little handy design board so I can carry everything over to the sewing machine. Our background 4.5 inch is going to be the center. And then our strips are going to go around the outside with the background on the outside. And then we're going to put our half square triangles in the corner with the colored piece going towards the center and the background on the outside. Ooh, you can see it taking shape now. So cute. Ta-da! There's our Churn Dash block. So now we just need to sew this together like a 9-patch block. I'm going to sew the right side to the center, chain piecing all of these, and then we'll add the other side to this row to make a row of 3. And then we'll iron the seams in opposite directions so that we can nest the seams and put the rows together. So let's take this over to the sewing machine. And I like to start in a seam that's not going to be really bulky with all of these seams here. So if I started my needle here, it may have trouble getting over all of these seams to start. So I'm going to flip the block around and start on this end here, making sure everything's lined up, raw edges are lined up. We have nothing to nest here, so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, I'm going to break thread here and clip apart these connecting threads. Now this last one that I just sewed was the last or the bottom of my block, so I know that I can just put that right back in place where it was. And then this middle one is the center row, and this is the top row. Okay, so I'm going to grab the other block, put those right sides together. And again, I'm going to flip it around so that I'm starting in that smoother section. Okay, now that we have all the rows sewn, I'm going to clip apart these connecting threads and let's take them to the ironing board. Okay, so that our seams are going to nest, we want to iron these in opposite directions. So what I'm going to do is iron this center going out because I don't want my seams showing in this white fabric. Usually I would make the center go towards the center, but because of this white fabric, I'm going to go out towards the outside. So what I'm going to do is set the iron in the middle and push that seam over, and then lift this opposite side so that I can push it over. Okay. And then these ones need to go opposite of that. So since these are going out, these are going to go in. So what I'm going to do is lay this one on the ironing board and lift these up so that the seam is laying on the board here, and let the iron push it over. And I will see a little bit of my seam over there, and that's okay. I was more concerned with the center one being shown because that's the center of attention. The outside blocks aren't going to be as noticeable. And since they're all going the same way, it will be totally fine. Okay, same with this one. Going to go towards the center. Okay, now we can take this back to the sewing machine, lay it back out the way that's supposed to go, and then we're going to take the middle and one of the ends and put them right sides together, and then we're going to nest this seam right here that we just ironed. So those seams are going to just butt right up next to each other. And if you feel it, you can tell that this seam is going towards the right. So it's got a little bit of a ledge right here, and this one's going the opposite direction. So those little ledges of our seams are going to butt right up next to each other, which is going to help us get those perfect points in the center. Okay, so let's go take these back to the sewing machine. It's more important to get your seams to nest than it is to get the outside edges to line up. So if your outside edges aren't lining up perfectly, that's okay. We can trim those up if need be. Just worry about nesting those seams in the center. So I'm just going to worry about this first one here. We're going to sew all the way past it and then stop and get the next one ready to go before we sew over it. That way you're not trying to juggle the entire block at one time, just little chunks at a time. So we just got this one done, sewed over it, and now I'm going to readjust this one to get it nested. It takes a little practice, but you'll get the hang of it really soon. And you'll be able to feel that that seam is laying flat when it is nested. If it's not, it'll feel bumpy, or it's going to feel hollow in the middle if it's not close enough to each other. Okay. All right, now we're going to continue to sew. I'm just going to hold down that piece that needs to stay nested until we get past it, and then I can readjust these layers so that they're lined up. Okay, I'm going to add the other side before we go to the ironing board, but let's check out those points. Look at that. Perfect. I love it. Now let's add this side. Make sure that it's going the right direction. You don't want to accidentally put it on upside down. It's too easy to do, and I've seen my students do it a million times. So make sure you put them together the right way. Just kind of lay it out real quick, make sure it looks correct, and then put the right sides together. Okay, so we're going to nest those first seams on the left hand side of the block first. Get everything lined up the best you can. If you need to use pins or wonder clips, that's just fine. There's no shame in that, but I would rather not wrestle with another thing. So I just figure out how to do it a little at a time, so I don't have to have pins next to me all the time. Now I will with certain things, like when I'm putting borders on, or if I'm putting long strips of rows together, just to help hold all the pieces together. But for these little blocks, we don't need them. All right, our block is done. We just need to go iron it one more time. And this time I'm going to iron those seams going out towards the outside blocks. So you want the center block, center row to be on your ironing board, to be flat, so that this seam is laying up. And then we can use the iron to push that seam over. Okay, and then we're going to go the opposite direction, so just make sure that that is laying flat. Kind of lift it up and then push your iron over it. And then I like to give the block a nice press going diagonally, just to get it to be nice and flat. You're not pulling or stretching on your fabric, however. And one final last step. It's very important that we square up our blocks when we're finished. That way they will all work together in our final quilt. This should be measuring 12.5 inches square. So I'm going to line up 4 1/4 with this first line going down this seam of the block, and 4 1/4 going this way, and that will help me find my center, because 6.5 or 6 1/4 is our center here, but we don't have any lines or seams to follow there, so it's easiest just to follow one of your seams on the side. So I'm going to line it up there, and then just double check all the way around my block, see if there's anything that needs squared up. And I have just a hair right here. Now the only thing to be careful of when you're squaring things up is that if you have points to your block, like we do here, we want 1/4 inch from that point to the edge of our block, so that when we put our sashing on or the block next to it, that we don't lose those perfect points. So keep that 1/4 inch from the point to the edge of your fabric. Okay. And then I have just a little bit on this side, so I'm going to flip it around, line it back up. Okay. And great job! You made the Churn Dash block. I can't wait to see pictures of this. I would love for you to show it on our show and tell page in our Facebook group, and I'll leave a link for you in the description box below. Hey, thanks so much for joining me today in making this Churn Dash block. I hope that you enjoyed this and that you're going to go make one yourself. Hey, we would love to see your quilt blocks as you're making them. We have a free show and tell Facebook page. The description link is in the box below. Make sure you go click over there, join us for all the quilting fun, and show off your quilt blocks. If you'd like more tips, tricks, and tutorials, I invite you to join our society, where you will get a library full of quilting tutorials just like this one to help you in your quilting journey. Next week, we're going to be making the shoe fly block. I'll see you then.